Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and every Thursday in September, we will cover performing arts organizations, issues, and leaders. And today, we are starting with special guest, Anwar Nasir, Executive Director at the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra in New Orleans. Anwar, I'm so pleased to have you on. We've been trying to get you on the show for, I think, at least 3/4 of a year. So you've given us a great gift. So thanks so much.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
So first of all, New Orleans is the musical town, right? I mean, it's the heart of jazz. It's the heart of these amazing traditions, the Zydeco and bounce, which is a new phenomena, the whole issue of the blues, and oh my God. Now, yeah. I have to say that when I think of New Orleans, I don't think of symphonic music. So correct my thinking.
Well, what's interesting here is, obviously New Orleans is very well situated, I think, in the American history, American tradition. No state came into the Union as epic and triumphant as Louisiana, right? So when you think about what happened and how we got here, there's all kinds of influences that have come to the city and to this region that have put together this wonderful tradition. So originally, when you think back to like late 1600s, early 1700s, when symphonic music, orchestral music was really starting to become a thing, there was a huge influence from immigrants coming into this country through this region. So there was a time where there were multiple opera houses here in the city and in the state. And of course, you can't have opera without having an orchestra. So really thinking through, I think they were doing something like 300 performances a year of opera, orchestral music, dance, because of the influence that you had from the French, from the English, from the Spanish, and really knowing that influence that has come here and it has been rooted here for all of that time. I think someone had a really savvy marketing plan when it came time for jazz and it came time for blues and a lot of these other ways of really influencing and saying what the culture of New Orleans, Louisiana is, because that's what we uniquely had. But the tradition of orchestral music, classical music, has been in this region for a very long time, and we're happy to keep carrying the torch forward.
Well, and the thing about that I find to be so fascinating is how orchestral music, how symphonic music was appropriated and then evolved, in which the sections of an orchestra where the instruments were more transportable, where the instruments were less expensive to acquire, and they could be developed further, they were appropriated and taken. Those segments of the music were taken and then changed. And that's one of the things that I think is so fascinating. The whole tradition in New Orleans and Louisiana of marching bands, right? Which you would never have a marching orchestra. But no. what is a marching band except for a section of the orchestra that's on foot? And
absolutely. Absolutely. And you think that there are even some instruments that are based on orchestral instruments that have been adapted specifically for a marching band. Like I think about, like, say, for instance, like a mellophone is a marching French horn. The same approach to playing it makes it a very similar sound, but it's very much geared towards just this specific use case, which I think as we look to the history of our instruments and what we get to do is that there are very specific periods of instruments period instruments that are played for this type of music. So we like to ebb and flow, and you get to really see that there's a good balance here, and we come together in a fun way, and we all get to play together in the street. So it's a really fun thing to be able to do.
Talk about the idea of technique as well. This whole idea of, for example, bending a note, right? Mm-hmm. In traditional European music from the 1800s, you didn't take notes and bend them the way you bend them today, right? You didn't take the improvisational piece and explicitly improvise, although even in those days, right, improvisation is part and parcel of the artist's craft. But now it's been taken into a totally different level, which now can then inform this ancient music that came from Europe over to the United States. Could you talk a little bit about how the various traditions, the rhythms, for example, that were quite unusual and quite unaccustomed in European music inform your repertoire. And then let's talk about your repertoire and exactly how you engage modern audiences with this older art form.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when we think about the core orchestral repertoire, like you said, it's very structured and regimented and how it's performed. And of course, there's a little bit of artistic license that is taken from conductor to orchestra and as you go around the country and around the world. But one thing that we've seen is that as more and more people get invited into this space and it becomes more, I don't want to say worldly because it's been worldly for a very long time, but I think that our approach to the way that we listen to, consume, and even play music has evolved over time. You know, it's meant to be living, right? It's not, you know, when it was originated, there were no recordings, right? So it was always living, breathing, evolving, and changing. And one thing that I think that people don't recognize and hold on to is that, you know, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, these, you know, symphonies and overtures, concertos were always being tinkered with. They, you know, like very few people got it right the first time. And there was going to be a little bit of evolvement, a little bit of evolving, a little bit changing. And that's okay. So one thing that happened when, especially around, you know, here in New Orleans and Louisiana, when jazz started to come into place, like you said, there were instruments that were getting introduced in new ways. People were hearing different things. And specifically with jazz, it starts from a home base and then it veers off a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and then you come back home. And we know that that's the basic structure of how a symphony works, right? You kind of expose your major themes in that first, you know, on the first movement. Then the second movement, you're going to veer a little bit away. Third movement is going to be a little bit different than that, and then you're going to bring it all back together at home again. So it's a lot of that same structure that's in there that we see in the music that was performed and originated here. That has its home base, I would say, in orchestral music, but it has evolved and it has grown and it has changed because the people, their life experience and the way that they approach it and their influence has allowed us to really see things in a different way, which I think is really fantastic. So to be an orchestra here in New Orleans is really, really wonderful because we get to do this. We get to do this thing where we get to play around with different musical styles, different traditions, and it allows us to come back and really play the core repertoire in a great way. So I think that it's a wonderful experience for our musicians, and anyone that gets to come in and hear the Louisiana Philharmonic here in New Orleans, they're in for a treat always, because we do a lot of things really, really well, which I think is really a way for us to distinguish ourselves in the market.
So Beethoven lived 300 years ago. If Beethoven is performed in Louisiana, in your orchestra, is it different than if it's performed in New England?
I would say it's a little bit different because the audience expectations are different. Now, one thing that I know and I think that I hear from our audiences a lot is how you bookend the pieces matter, right? So it's not like you can just plop in a Beethoven 7 and think that it's going to stand really well on its own. But what are you doing with your overture? What are you doing with your concerto? What are you doing with your encore if you're going to have one? And how do you want your audience to perceive that piece of music at that time? And it allows us to really have a space where you can help curate the performance in a way. You know, it's not always wash, rinse, repeat of the same thing. We like to say, okay, well, we did it this way last time. How do we want to walk them into the hall tonight? How do we want them to hear and get ready for this Beethoven? And what do we want them to walk away with?
This connects to your field, right? You came up through the marketing line. You came up through audience engagement. So what you're saying is it's not just a matter of what is on stage. It's how you allow the audience to approach the stage, to approach the piece, to engage them even before they come into the hall. And then once they're in the hall, it's that whole overarching experience. What is it like now with you being the executive director versus you being the marketing director? Are you having the kind of conversations that you craved as a marketing director now with your artistic director, in which you're basically saying, okay, you're representing the art, I'm representing the audience, let's come together and create an experience that's just amazing. Are you having those conversations today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I would say one of the draws for me to want to get into the role that I sit in specifically is being able to have some power and some influence over what it is that we get to do as an organization. So that was one of the main draws for me to want to sit in this chair. But We have a really fantastic model here in Louisiana where we're collaboratively operated, right? So our musicians, our music director, our staff, all, and our trustees, our board of trustees as well, all get to contribute into what it is that we're going to do as an organization. And we do this day in and day out. So the interesting part about it is that I get to be able to represent, like I said, the audience, what we want to be able to hear and experience, and what it gets to feel like. Because I'm, more often than not talking with a lot of our patrons. I'm welcoming them into the hall. I get to connect with them, and so when they like something, they'll tell me about it. But when they don't like something, they'll tell me about it even more, which is really, really helpful. But then we get the perspective from the musicians as well to say, I really like when we put these things together, and we'll get to pull on some threads there and say, okay, well, when you say that, you like this overture, this concerto, and this symphony together, what exactly does that feel like? And what does that mean for you artistically? And then it helps us be able to go back and say to the audience that when you're here and listening to our musicians, that this is why this music is important, right? Because it becomes more than just notes on the page that they're playing. They're wanting to make sure that this is an experience for all of us together. So it really builds out this ecosystem, and it's really helpful for us as an organization to think about things much more holistically than just like, all right, we want to play this, this, and this. Okay, go. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, but we always have to think about all of the pieces to the puzzle. Is it going to make sense at the box office? Is it going to make sense for our audience? Are we serving our core audience? Are we trying to serve a new audience? And we can do all of these things at the same time. We just have to be very thoughtful about it. And is it serving the musicians as well? So that's always a part that I like to include.
So people have been talking in the symphony world and the classic arts world in general about younger audiences, about more diverse audiences. Talk with us about what does your audience look like? Who are your audiences? Who is coming into the hall? Who is buying tickets over and over and over again? How old are they? What kind of ethnic profile does your audience have?
Yeah, so what's interesting here, and I've been working in orchestras for about the last 10 years or so, and I've been in 3 different parts of the country. This is my 3rd orchestra that I've been a part of, and it's been really fascinating to me to see that there's a core audience that exists for, core symphonic repertoire. So we're talking about the Beethovens, the Tchaikovskys, the Brahms, and the Bach, and Mozart, and those guys. But then I feel really fortunate that the orchestras that I've been a part of have seen their view as being much more broad than just, preserving this music that has been a part of our tradition for a long time. It's about
it's not just repetition of what you already know.
Not just repetition of what we've already done. How can we push things forward? I think about my time when I was with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and during our centennial celebration, we said we're going to commission 50 new works to be performed over the course of the season. And we ended up somewhere about 52 to 54. And that was really, really like eye-opening for me as an arts administrator to think like, all right, we committed to this and we said we're going to do it. And we didn't have to sacrifice anything else that we didn't stop playing all of the music that we know and love, but we created space for us to do these new things. And my time in Omaha, it's a much smaller city, much smaller community, but still an orchestra that was coming up on celebrating 100 years, and really thinking about what can this orchestra uniquely do for its community, and making sure that we're able to speak to younger and older generations in a way that's really, really fascinating. We would do a show with a band called Guster, and we recorded and released that as an album that did really well. But then we would also do things with like a night of Motown, and then we would also have a night full of Beethoven's music. So it was really thinking about how do we capture all segments of our audience. We know that there aren't people like I like to equate it to something similar, like if I were on NBC, right? And I know that I have an audience that likes comedy. I know that I have an audience that likes drama. I know that I have an audience that likes reality television. And if we said that we're only going to serve comedy, then we're missing entire segments of the audience base. And then we know that we can build in layers to that and really think through, like, there are going to be people that like younger comics and younger up and coming artists. And then there are going to be people that like, a more established. And we have time, space, and opportunity to serve all of those groups. So
you're taking a portfolio management approach to programming, so that yes, you are purposefully looking at your audience and their tastes, and you're saying, okay, we're not just going to serve, to take your analogy, news all day, right? Mm-hmm. We're not just going to serve comedy all day. we're not just going to serve Beethoven or Brahms or Mozart all day, right? You're going to actually mix it up. So talk a little bit about how that manifests in a way that connects to audiences that actually attract family with kids, for example, or that attracts the traditionalists, or that attracts the people who are walking in and they want to listen to something unusual, that's challenging, that has that verve. How do you program for that?
Absolutely. So I think this is one of the advantages that that orchestras have in the traditional Western European art forms that we have. That's a opera, ballet to some extent, but dance, theater don't have, right? Because we can have 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of music on one night. So that allows us to be able to say, well, if you're into new music, then we have this piece for you. And we're going to pair this with something that is going to be, a war horse, so to speak. So we're going to be able to serve 2 audience groups there. We're able to, at this point, we have some very wonderful family programs that have been done time and time again. And I think through that, growing up with such wonderful music that was featured in cartoons and featured in, that gets played in commercials and things like that. So children are being exposed to wonderful music, and we just have to be able to present it to them. And when you connect the dots and make it accessible for them, then it becomes wonderful. I think that parents are always looking for something just educational and fun to do with their children, and we like to be able to do that. But then when we start looking at younger and more diverse audiences, we think about like, okay, well, what role does like maybe movies play, and how do we connect those specific movies to those audiences, and knowing, okay, well, what's working, what's not working, and we can't just say like, and I'm a big Star Wars fan, but as lovely as those are, that's a specific demographic, and we can continue to serve those because now we have 9 of them in order that we could do, right? But then there are new ones that are coming up, like I think, obviously Black Panther is touring now, which I think is really fantastic. So
you have this Lemony Snicket thing that's going on. So there you have The Composer is Dead by music by Nathaniel Stuckey and words by Lemony Snicket.
Yep, exactly.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, so it's really, really fun to be able to do things like that I think really allow us to connect to like stories that people know and love, and connect that with music, and then feel like we're creating an ecosystem for them in a place that they can feel comfortable. And so that feels really, really good for us.
How many of your colleagues across the classical music field are Black and male and young?
I would say that there's a handful of us, which is really, really fortunate. When I came into my role about a year or so ago, I think that there were maybe 3 or 4 that were in smaller orchestras than the one that I'm in. And now there are several that are across the country, and even we have one in Canada now, which I think is really, really fantastic. But it's a growing space. People are feeling like maybe we need to try something a little bit different and make sure that people are seeing that the organization is ready, willing, and able to make a change, and giving us an opportunity to lead. We have the abilities to do so. We just haven't been given the opportunity. So I feel really fortunate to be amongst a group of very, very smart and talented leaders of orchestras that are also, Black and brown.
Is your connection to the audience that comes out of your own lived experience as a younger person, as male, as being Black, and other aspects of who you are? Do you feel that this actually allows this symphony and others that you work with to benefit from a different way of thinking, so that you have a lot more different threads of thoughts and traditions that inform this very classical music? Is this part of enlivening this, to have these different choices and ideas rather than having everybody coming from one place?
Absolutely. I think it's critical to have not only diversity of thought, but diversity in the people that you have around the table. We know that we benefit from having different textures and different approaches to things. And when we look at how we approach programming, how we approach fundraising, how we approach community engagement, when you have people that can speak from different lived experiences, that only makes the opportunities broader and better. I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine, or two colleagues of mine last week, about how America is always uses this term like a melting pot, right? That everybody comes in and they get to go in and then they just make something new out of it, right? And I said, I always struggle with that term, and I couldn't figure out why. And my colleague told me, I know exactly why you say that you have a problem with it, is because a melting pot, you kind of lose who you are in that. And she's from New Orleans, and she said it's more like a gumbo, where all of these pieces come into, like, you have your sausage, you might have your shrimp, your chicken, your rice and your vegetables, and they all come in. They don't lose who they are, but they all come together to make something really special. And
I couldn't agree more. I look at it also as an alloy, right? An alloy which is stronger because of the combination of substances, metals, and so on, carbon,
exactly,
to create something, right? It doesn't, those molecules don't lose their identity. They just function in their own way to make things stronger. Gumbo, right? You eat a gumbo and you have these bursts of flavor, right? All over the place, but it's not mush, right?
No, exactly.
Open, right?
Yeah.
And so that character, that distinctive character, talk about your musicians. Do your musicians sometimes traverse different styles, or do they each keep strictly into the traditions of, French horn or trumpet or violin that is within that particular orchestral 300-year-old segment of music?
Our musicians come from many different, they have many different passions. And I would say that there's a really wonderful opportunity here, because many of them will go in and they'll play with other artists, and they'll come in. A lot of them will go in and they'll play with The Who. They'll play with many other people that'll come into town, which I think is really, really fantastic. They'll play at Jazz Fest. They'll play at French Quarter Fest. Some of them will take Mardi Gras gigs, and which I think is really, really fantastic. But then also they have their own ensembles, which I think is wonderful too. So they come together and play the music that is also meaningful for them. So when you take, a 70-piece orchestra and now you break it down into a quartet or a trio, then it allows them to get into spaces, which is really, really helpful. And I think that they also bring that level of musicianship back to the orchestra when they come together to play as a whole. They'll go off and they'll work as studio musicians, which I think also sharpens their technique in new ways, because now you're playing music that's going to be featured in a commercial or a film, and the music is different, because you might be the only one there, and you're very, for lack of a good term, very exposed in those moments, and it gives them a unique opportunity to really hone in on their own skill sets. And then when they come back to us, there is this sense of like they're all better musicians because that they're taking all of these additional opportunities for them to continue to fulfill their own artistic desires, which I think is really, really wonderful.
So you're not a supporter of everybody staying in their own lane, and if you're in marketing, you stay in marketing, and if you're in development, you stay in development, and if you're scheduling performances, you stay in. Are you, when you bring your team together, how does your team function so that you also have the benefit of these cross-fertilizing ideas that you were just referencing amongst your musicians?
Yeah, it's a really wonderful opportunity for us to all come together. And I think that, one thing we try to do is make sure that everybody stays in the loop on everything. Like I said, the collaboration is baked into who we are as an organization, which I think allows us to just not have to force it. It just is there. So we have a lot of committees that will come together and meet pretty frequently to say, is this working? Is this not working? What do we want to do? What do we want to be? How do we want to impact the community? And they're always, like I said, always musicians, always staff, always trustees. And what that does is that, we're always thinking about it from the specific chair that we're in. So then that way, when I come to the table, I'm representing, my role here. And when our musicians come, they say, okay, well, this music doesn't challenge us enough, or you're not thinking big enough. And then our trustees may come in and say, oh, well, wouldn't it be great? Or I know someone who, they get to say, I know someone who might support this, who might be thinking about, this is a new community for us to be a part of. And how do we bring all of these things together? It really is really fantastic for us, because it's so thoughtful and committed and very organic. It never feels forced, which is really, really helpful.
How do you define excellence in this kind of a circumstance? Because very often excellence is defined as staying in your lane and being increasingly narrow but deep. right? In which case that creates a preconception of what a talent should look like. Now, that preconception might mean that a particular person, a Jascha Heifetz, for example, has amazing technique in that person's field. But if you take them out of that particular narrow area where they are undoubtedly excellent, they could not necessarily compete using that same instrument, but in a different style, in which case you end up relegating the style of music to a very narrow type of ways of playing it, right? So if you look at how you assess talent, right, your musicians are very much skew out of the European traditions of symphony orchestras, which are dominated by white musicians, right?
Yes.
Your management team might have a particular literal complexion or a particular literal age, right, that comes out of these traditions. How do you break the mold while honoring the traditional skills, yet not holding yourself hostage to just the traditional skills and allowing new skills to enliven and change and transform who you are, what you play? How do we transform America? I mean, we're asking a bigger question than just symphonies. How do we deal with this, Anwar?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question, and I think that there are times where, you know, excellence, perfectionism is necessary. You know, to be able to achieve something and do it really well, it is really important. But you have to be able to line up a space where you really can be innovative and creative and push there. You know, there's a phrase that is, you know, where good enough is great enough. And it's just say, okay, how do we get to this point where we can say, is this good enough for what we need to do? Is it ever going to be exactly perfect? Maybe, maybe not. But one thing that I try to make sure that we're very thoughtful about is when the art is happening on stage, right? Or in the community, however it may be, right? Like there will be times where it's not exactly perfect because we are not robots, you know, and we have to realize that we are living, breathing human beings, and we'll do everything to the best of our power to get it to be exactly what we want it to be. However, we know that it's going to be a little bit different, and that's okay because you were in the room at this unique point in time, and as long as you enjoyed it, then we're going to be okay. So when I think about the innovation, I try to think through, all right, well, what can we build around maybe the art to push us and evolve us forward? We have a concert that we're doing with Big Frida next year, who's a bounce artist from New Orleans. And as far as I know, and as far as we know, no one has ever paired an orchestra with bounce music. So for me, I start to think through like, okay, well, what steps do we need to put into place to make sure that this is actually going to be a truly authentic experience for the people that know and love her music? And I say, okay, well, what things do we normally do as an orchestra to get there, right? We make sure that we have great charts. We make sure that we have an opportunity for us to listen and to hear it beforehand, to make sure that we're going to do some reading sessions. We're going to maybe record it and go back and listen to it and really connect back in a way that allows us to think through, we're honoring who we are, but also honoring them and the bounce traditions as well. So we were thinking like, okay, well, do we need to have this be a seated audience, or does this need to be an audience that's going to be able to stand up and dance? And ultimately we decided to go back to having a seated audience. We said, if people want to get up and dance, they're going to get up and dance. They're not going to wait for us to give them a green light to go. It's just going to happen naturally. And we just wanted to make sure that we had it available as an option for people. So really thinking through, like, we can innovate on one side of the aisle or the other, and that's okay. And that's going to push us forward and allow us to approach things in new and creative ways. And that is going to just be, we're going to have to live in a world of, you know, perfect imperfection, so to speak.
I love it. Perfect imperfection. I love the experimentation. I love the idea of looking at your repertoire as a portfolio of different experiences. I love the interactions amongst the artists, your management team, the artistic director, your board, the community, and this whole idea of if you're going to improvise, you're going to blow a bad note every once in a while. That's also part of the process, right? If you're not blowing a bad note every once in a while, you're just not trying hard enough.
Exactly.
Anwar Nasir, thank you so much. What a great set of ideas that will guide us not only in our arts lives, but also in just our civil society lives. You and your orchestra, the Louisiana Philharmonic Orchestra, are really a real model for us all. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. Please thank your team, your artists, your artistic director, your board, and your community for really giving us the gift of your wisdom that we can share today.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate you having me.
Have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
Take care.